I've been telling a lot of stories about Iceland and often about the history of Iceland. And but was wondering whether people really had a holistic view of the history in Iceland. The history covers about 1100 years, a little more maybe. And people that have been to Iceland or even watched uh, these travel shows that I've been doing, they know that we started out as quite independent people, and then we lost our independence, and for a while we were under the Norwegians, and then the Danes, and then, well, for a long time under the Danish. As a matter of fact, Iceland was ruled in the past, or has been ruled in the past, by no less than 30 different kings, either Norwegian or Danish ones, and at least one queen. And we haven't been independent for a long time. But I was thinking of doing a little show tonight about a little talk about the whole history, so you can piece it together from the beginning to the end, and have the dates clear. And of course, telling the history of Iceland would take, well, it would take many books to do it well, because although that people often say, well, from about 1200 and onward, nothing really much happened in Iceland. Well, nothing much that the history books are pretty scarce and empty on things that happened in Iceland for over 600 years. But this was the time when Icelanders really sort of developed their skills of storytelling, and all kinds of rhyming and poetry became the occupation of the nation. So incredible that when there hasn't been a battle or any kind of warfare in Iceland for now almost 700 years. And well, history is always, if you don't count the battles, it's some too many. It's not a history if there's no war. But we didn't have any wars, and but at the same time, by the time we had laid down the sword and the shield, people picked up the pen and started writing books and poetry. And sometimes those weren't even written down. They just lived by mouth from generation to a generation. So many of our stories that we are still telling were made up in these, or happened, actually, some of them really did happen, in this period of where there was no history in Iceland. So why don't we start by having a short overview over the sort of how the storybooks handle Iceland, the history of Iceland, and then I'm gonna tell a story. Well, I've already told it before, and I have the video, but I've had some requests to repeat it, because it was one of the first stories I did. It is called The Deacon of Dark River. I know some of you may have caught it, but others did not, and this is probably why people have written to me and asked if they could see it again, or I could put it on again. And since I'm not in Iceland and didn't have the opportunity to go out and film new stuff, I'm going to play that story once we have had a little overview of Icelandic history. So I'm going to share here. And here we have that little film that I made earlier this evening about the history of Iceland. Let's see if we can start that. The first permanent settler in Iceland is usually considered to have been a Norwegian chieftain named Ingólfur Arnarson. According to the story, he threw 2 carved pillars overboard as he spotted the coast, vowing that he would settle wherever they landed. He then sailed along the coast until the pillars were found in the southwestern peninsula known as Reykjaneskai. There he settled with his family around 874 in a place named Reykjavik due to the geothermal steam rising from the earth, the reeking cove. Ingólfur was followed by many more Norse chieftains, their families and slaves, who occupied all the inhabitable areas of the island in the next decades. In the year 930, the ruling chiefs established an assembly called Alþingi, Alþing. This parliament was convened each summer at Þingvellir, the assembly fields, and amended laws, settled disputes, and appointed juries to judge lawsuits. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the notable independence of local farmers and chieftains gave way to the growing power of a handful of families and their leaders. The period from around 1200 to 1262 is generally known as Sturlungaöld, the age of the Sturlungs. This refers to Sturla Þórðarson and his sons, Þórður, Sighvatur, and Snorri, who were one of the 2 main clans fighting for power over Iceland. In 1220, Snorri Sturluson became a vassal of Hákon IV, King of Norway, and his nephew, Sturla Sighvatsson, also became a vassal in 1235. Sturla used the power and influence of the Sturlungar family to wage war against other clans in Iceland. After decades of conflict, the Icelandic chieftains agreed to accept the sovereignty of Norway and signed the old covenant, Gamli Sáttmáli, establishing a union with the Norwegian monarchy. Iceland remained under Norwegian rule until 1380, when the Norwegian male royal line was extinguished with the death of Olaf IV, King of Norway. And thus Iceland became a part of the Kalmar Union along with Sweden and Denmark, with Denmark becoming the dominant power. Unlike Norway, Denmark did not need Icelandic fish or homespun wool. This created a dramatic deficit in Iceland's trade, and as a result, no new ships for continental trading were built. With the introduction of absolute monarchy in Denmark, Norway in 1660, under Frederick III, the Icelanders relinquished their autonomy to the crown, including the right to initiate and consent to legislation. In 874, 1,000 years after the first acknowledged settlement, Denmark granted Iceland home rule, which again was expanded in 1904. The constitution, written in 1874, was revised in 1903, and the Minister for Icelandic Affairs, residing in Reykjavik, was made responsible to Alþing. The Act of Union of 1st of December 1918, an agreement with Denmark, recognized Iceland as a fully sovereign state, the Kingdom of Iceland, joined with Denmark in a personal union with the Danish king. Iceland established its own flag and asked Denmark to represent its foreign affairs and defense interests. The act would be up for revision in 1940, and could be revoked 3 years later if agreement was not reached. Following a referendum, Iceland formally became an independent republic on June 17, 1944, while Denmark was still occupied by Germany. Despite this, the Danish king, Christian X, sent a message of congratulations to the Icelandic people. So we got that covered now. But this is, it may sort of sound and a bit dry to you, but it really is, there's a lot of history in between. You know, when you tell the story of the first settler in Iceland, who probably wasn't the first settler, Ingólfur Arnarson, who everybody, you know, we have a statue of him, and in all the history books, they will tell us that he was the first acknowledged settler. And they think it is strange that he, for some reason, threw the most valuable things that he had into the sea and decided to build his farmstead where they drifted ashore. That this is kind of strange. But the first settlers, the Vikings, basically, they were incredibly religious people. Of course, they weren't Christians, but they had their own religion. And all the images carved on those pillars were of their gods, of Odin and Thor, and Baldur and Freyr and Freya, and goddesses. And they didn't want to do anything, or at least not to be seen doing anything without, nothing important anyway, without consulting the gods. And this is why when Ingólfur approaches Iceland, he throws out his high seat columns to make so that the gods would determine where he would live. Now, it is kind of a coincidence that Reykjavik became the capital of Iceland, because that it was not the biggest town when Icelanders started to build towns in Iceland. It was not the biggest town at all. And it had a much worse harbor than the nearby settlement or Hafnarfjörður or harbor town, which indicates that it was named because of its good harbor. But Reykjavik won out in the end, probably because of its hot water supply. Reykur, the word reykur has an English counterpart, reeking. It meant steam. Steam was reeking out of the ground, smoking, evaporating. It means steam. And it was the hot water that made the difference for the people. They could wash their clothes, and they could, yeah, mostly it was because they had access to hot water to wash things. The most famous area in Iceland is what we call Laugardalur. It means washing valley. It's where all the sport facilities are in Reykjavik, and the big swimming pool that many people visiting Iceland go to. So a lot of history in the things that you see in the history books that are not really properly explained at times. Well, Ingólfur, it says in the little epistle that I read to you, that he sailed around the peninsula and found his pillars in this cove that he called Reykjavik. That isn't actually true, because Ingólfur, he took land in the south of Iceland, and then he sent his slaves searching the beaches for his pillars, and they found them eventually in Reykjavik, having walked probably around 300-400 kilometers or more along the beaches when they finally found the pillars. Now, in the period of time when nothing is said to have happened in Iceland, we were going through the Icelandic dark ages, if you like. and they were dark. Iceland was going through a very, very cold period, and the Icelanders, they abandoned the surface to live on, and buried themselves into the ground and lived in what amounted to mud holes. Uh, People called them turf houses, and some of them were, I guess, turf houses, but most of them were just hovels uh, in the ground with hardly any opening to them except to get in, no windows, just to keep warm. They would sometimes even try to house their animals on a lower floor in order to use the heat from the animals on the upper floors. And during those long winter nights, they would come together, and they would all live in one room. They would call it baðstofa, the bathing room. That was not its purpose, though, although they called it. And people would sleep together, two and two in a bed, and uh, in the evening they would tell stories when they were working their wool or doing work that they could do by their hands. They would tell each other stories, and often they were not nice stories. They were ghost stories and stories of trolls and terrible things that would happen. And those that were really good storytellers, they could do the rhymes. The rhymes are an old form of poetry in Iceland, not actually unlike the rap music that is now so popular. It's interesting that because although the Icelanders, they tried to sing it, it sort of had a rhythm to it. It was more complicated than the poetry that you have in the modern day rap, but it still had a story to tell, always a story. And these were the masters that could do the rhymes. But eventually, Icelanders, when they had become a Christian nation, they were not really fully Christians, because even in their horror stories where Christianity has a place, they still mix it in with the old religion, although it had maybe been gone for several hundred years. So much of the language and the customs that we have is derived from those olden days, and it is hard really to tell a story without involving it in one way or another. So I made a few months back this little video of a story that is so well known in Iceland that probably every kid could tell it to you. It is the story of the Dark Deacon, or the Deacon from Dark River. That's the name of the farm where he was from. So I'm going to play that for you. Got it somewhere here. I'm going to have to share the video again, the screen, for you to be able to see it. So let's do that. Okay, here we go. Here is the Deacon of Dark River. The following story is one of the most famous Icelandic ghost stories. In Icelandic folklore, the ghosts often speak in verse, repeating the last word of each line. Furthermore, ghosts are not able to say the word God in any form, or Guð in Icelandic. The story takes place at Christmas in the north of Iceland and features an unnamed deacon, his fiancée Guðrún, and his horse Paxi. There once was a deacon who lived on a farm called Myrká, Dark River, in Eyjafjörður, north of Iceland. His name is not known, but he was engaged to a woman whose name was Guðrún. Guðrún was a servant at a vicarage in Bægisá farm close by, on the other side of the river Hörgá.
The deacon had a grey horse with a thick mane that he called Paxi, which he rode wherever he went. Sometimes before Christmas, the deacon arrived at Bægisá, inviting Guðrún to join the festivities at Myrká on Christmas Eve. The deacon spent the night, and when he bid Guðrún farewell the next morning, he said he would come to pick her up on Christmas Eve, in time for the celebrations. The days before the deacon's visit, heavy snow had fallen, and the weather was frosty, and a thick layer of ice covered Hörgá River, which ran between the two farms. Then there was a sudden thaw and snow melt, causing the water level of Hörgá to rise considerably and the ice to break, making the river impassable. When the deacon rode back to Myrká, he didn't take into consideration the sudden weather change and thought he could ride across Hörgá on the ice. But the river was no longer frozen, and so the deacon rode up along the river until he found a spot which was still icy all the way to the other bank. The deacon rode into the ice, but mid-river the ice broke, and he fell down into the river. The next morning, a farmer from Þúfuvellir, a neighboring farm, saw the horse with a bridle and saddle outside his fence and recognized the deacon's Paxi. This made him concerned, because he had noticed that the deacon rode to Bægisá the day before, but hadn't seen him return. The farmer approached Paxi, wet and shivering, and suspected the worst. He walked along Hörgá, looking for the deacon, and eventually found him dead at the riverbank. The farmer went to Myrká and gave the people there the tragic news. When they came to pick up the body, they noticed that the back of the deacon's head was severely wounded, probably from a block of ice which had hit the deacon's head after he had fallen into the river. The deacon was buried at Myrká a week before Christmas. From the fateful day, the deacon left Bægisá, and until Christmas Eve, Hörgá had remained impassable, so no one could have informed Guðrún about the passing of her fiancé. However, on Christmas Eve, the weather had turned calm and cool, and Guðrún started to look forward to the party at Myrká. In the afternoon, Guðrún started getting ready and was almost finished when she heard a knock on the door. Someone else answered, but there was no one outside. Darkness had fallen, but the moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape whenever there was a hole in the cloud cover. Guðrún told the girl who had answered the door that she would go outside. She grabbed her coat in a rush, but only put on one of the sleeves, but slung the other over her shoulder. Outside, Guðrún saw Paxi in front of the door and a man standing next to the horse, whom she took to be the deacon. They didn't speak, but the man held Guðrún up on Paxi's back and then mounted the horse himself, sitting in front of her. They rode off, and neither of them uttered a single word. When they had almost reached Hörgá, they rode up a hill, and when Paxi went down the other side, the deacon's hat lifted. At the same time, the moon broke through the clouds, lighting up the deacon's naked skull. Then he broke the silence. The moon glides, death rides. Can't you see a white spot in the back of my head? Garu, Garu. Terrified, Guðrún realized that the deacon must surely be dead, because he could no longer say the first part of her name. Oh God. I see what is, she responded, and then fell silent. When they arrived at Myrká, the deacon stopped outside the graveyard and said, "Wait here, Garu. Yarn, while I take Foxy, Foxy away from the yard. The deacon left the horse, and Guðrún looked into the graveyard. There she noticed an open grave and became frightened. She ran towards the church and grabbed the bell cord. Suddenly, the deacon was back, grabbing her from the behind, trying to pull her into the grave. Guðrún was lucky that she had been in such a rush to put her coat on, because the deacon grabbed a hold of the loose sleeve and pulled so hard that he tore it off at the seams. The deacon fell backwards into the grave, still holding on to the torn sleeve, and the dirt was swept in from both sides. Frantically, Guðrún rang the church bells until the people of Myrká came running. They took her inside the park and told her what had happened to the deacon. That same night, after Guðrún was in bed and the lights had been turned off, the deacon's ghost returned, tormenting Guðrún. Terrified, she screamed, waking everyone. The ghost disappeared, but always returned after dark, and Guðrún could never be left alone. Eventually, a sorcerer from Skagafjörður in northwest Iceland was called to Myrká. He ordered that a huge rock should be dug up and moved to the park. In the evening, after darkness had fallen, the deacon arrived and tried to enter the park, but the sorcerer started jumping, barring the deacon entrance, making the ghost retreat south of the park and disappear into the ground. The sorcerer then rolled the rock on the top, and there the deacon remains, trapped till this day. After this, there was no haunting of Myrká, and Guðrún returned to Bægisá. However, she never fully recovered from the ordeal.
Traditionally, you end the story in Iceland by saying, "Köttur út í mýri, sett upp á sér stýri, úti er ævintýri."
Well, let's get our face enlarged again. Yeah, it's not just the children, not just the adults that enjoy a story like this. This is a typical children's story in Iceland, and they get even worse. I remember one of the first stories that I heard and remember still as a kid was the story of this young girl that had been hired to work in one of those, well, during the winter in Iceland, when there was hardly anything to do on the farm, the young men, they would go to the seaside and they would stay in those little huts. And they would go on those small boats, try to catch some fish, and they were paid in fish. That would be their salary, the fish that they caught. And usually they tried to get a woman, a young girl usually, to come and tend to them, cook their food, and make sure that the clothes were mended and so on. And this story tells about this 18-year-old girl who was employed as such a servant girl. Now the sailors, there were 8 of them that manned the boat. And they were soon to find out that Fjóla, that was the name of that girl, she was afraid of the dark. And they would always, being kind of mean, start telling stories in the evening about ghosts and trolls and something horrible to try to frighten her. She kind of she asked them not to do it, but they would do it anyway. But then came the time when they figured that they would really terrify her, because after bad weather, one evening, they found a man's hand on the beach, sticking out of the seaweed. And of course, they took it, and very sneakily, they put it in her bed, underneath her bedding. Now the situation was such in those little huts that only her bed was really sort of quartered off with a what we call brekan. It is basically it's a curtain of a type that just hang down from the ceiling and over her bed. So she had a bit of a privacy. Anyway, they start that evening to, after having placed the hand in her bed, to tell stories. And they were more horrible than anything. And she didn't seem to mind this time. Eventually, they put out the lights, and she went into her bed, and nobody could see what was happening there. And they waited for her to do the screaming and the being terrified, but they heard nothing. They heard nothing, and eventually they lit the light again, probably a kerosene lamp or candle, and went over to her bed and pulled the curtain. And there she sat. The story goes, her hair had turned white, and in front of her, the hand lay all chewed up by her. She had, in her terror, become, the animal instinct had kicked in, and she had bitten the hand, so there was hardly anything left on it. She went quite mad after that, the story goes. But for a 10-year-old, this was a horrible story. I haven't told it before, I think, but I was reminded of these gruesome stories just listening again to myself telling the story of the deacon from Dark River. But I think on that note, I'm gonna actually call it quits. Leave you with these wonderful thoughts of Icelandic ghosts and ghoulies. And I don't know if you have had the opportunity to read any of the Icelandic novels, but not the modern novels. Well, the modern novels are pretty gruesome as well. But for example, the stories of that our Nobel laureate Halldór Laxness wrote. He obviously wrote novels, and there's one called Independent People. Now, if you want to find a really depressing story, something that will, make you sad for days, then you should pick up that book and read it because it's darker than the deacon from Dark River. Yeah, on that cheery note, I'm gonna call it quits tonight. Thanks for joining, and I guess you may be able to see me next Wednesday. So, all the best. Goodbye.